Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another lecture in the series of Barts 900, looking up to the Barts 900th anniversary, only just a few months away. Our guest this evening, Euan Roger, the medieval history specialist, and we'll be hearing a lot more from Euan during the course of the session. Just a few notes, though, before we begin, and you'll all have read, I hope you'll have read, about the very special event that occurred last week when His Majesty King Charles visited us to see the latest progress in the project and to meet some of the donors that have made the project a reality, giving us the chance to start the building work, hopefully in the middle of next year, May or June time. And the even latest news on that progress is that we are considerably less than the figure that I mentioned in the newsletter. We are only £160,000 away from the target. Thanks in large part to the many of you who pressed the donate button to add an extra contribution to the total. And the good news also is that the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which has promised us £4.5 million if we can match fund that amount, is meeting today. And we should hopefully hear the good news that they've agreed to release that amount to create that magic total of 9 million that will allow the project to proceed. Lots more exciting stuff to look forward to over the next 6 months. We're just putting together our program of events leading up to what will be the highlight of the year for many members of the Barts community, I'm sure, the View Day. We're calling it View Week here because we're going to be cramming so much into that day around Wednesday, May the 10th. And news of that in newsletters to come. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's crack on with it. Euan, welcome to Barts. Now, people will have read about your work as a medieval history specialist. They will have heard about your contribution to the book that we're putting together to celebrate Barts 900. So tell us a little more about yourself and how you came to be part of this project.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for welcoming me here this evening. I've been working on Barts now for a little over a decade, I believe. I actually wrote my MA thesis on the medieval hospital, and because I was brought here by one of my supervisors and told to look at the church and look at the building and try and pick out the medieval elements from it. And ever since then, I've been absolutely hooked on the hospital and its history. So I've done a lot of work here with the archives, and particularly the 15th century archives, which is what I'll be talking about tonight, supplemented by some of the documents we've got at the National Archives.
Tell us a little bit more about our own archive here. I think we're all familiar with various key elements of the archives over the years. In the 899 years we've been going, has it been a good archive to work with? Has there been lots of material to suit you and your particular expert interest?
Yeah, the archive here is absolutely incredible. It's one of the best medieval archives for a hospital in the UK, certainly, and across much of Europe. And it's got just such a wide range of important documents that tell the history of this community, of the buildings, of the properties that the hospital owned. And it's got the most amazing cartulary. So a cartulary is a status symbol document which records the hospital's most important deeds. And it is absolutely beautifully illuminated and illustrated throughout. It was written by a man who I'll be talking about shortly, and it's just fantastic. If any of you get the opportunity, do go and see it, because it's quite something. I've got some pictures to illustrate as we go through today, but they don't quite do full justice to just how amazing it is.
Well, without further ado, then let's crack on and load up the pictures.
So yeah, I thought it'd be useful to start by talking a bit about what medieval hospital is and what it looks like, because so little of the medieval fabric still remains today. So I thought I'd take us through a couple of maps, plans of the hospital site, and kind of just try and situate us physically in where the medieval chapel would have been. So there's a few points to kind of pick out here. You'll see on the left-hand image, this is a plan of what the hospital would have looked like around about the early Tudor period. And as you'll see, there are no hospital buildings. And it probably doesn't need saying, but hospitals at this time are not what we would think of today as medical establishments. They are very much charitable institutions. They provide spiritual support for people as well as charitable works. And so you'll see on this plan, we've got the Church of the Holy Cross, which is the current St. Bartholomew's the Less church. It's only a very small amount of medieval fabric survives, but the floor plan is largely similar to what would have been there in the medieval period, or for much of the medieval period. And we've also, medical care at this time was partly based around the provision of pleasant places to live. So we see throughout the hospital gardens. I think there are about 13 gardens within the precinct alone. And we can see at the top of the image here, that garden is the area known as Paradise in the medieval hospital. That's where it's a large garden surrounded by tenements and properties with shops looking out onto Smithfield. And it's meant to be a lovely area. It's the kind of place that people want to live. And then down the bottom, we've got the cloister, and there are two chapels in the center of the image. This is the area which is now the central square of the hospital. It takes over at this point, and the cloister is the area where care would have been provided for the sick poor. So this is very much charitable. It's almost palliative care is the primary thing that's going on here. But they also have a reputation in the medieval period for looking after children, children of single mothers who are in Newgate prison, or women who had died in childbirth, and they would provide education for them up to the age of 7 before they try and find a place to go and work. So we can see on the right-hand plan here, this is the hospital after the dissolution. So this is in the 17th century. And you can see it roughly takes the same shape as the medieval hospital. The shape, the thoroughfares into the precinct don't really change throughout the period. But if we go to a more modern view, you can see here that central square takes over where that area where the chapels are. And the area around those chapels would also have been full of people living and working in that space. So you can see the gate in the top way and the route down to the central square. You've got Bartholomew's Lane coming in from the east, and you've got routes going out through the south as well. So the hospital fundamentally doesn't change its shape, but it repurposes into a much more modern space for healthcare as it is today.
I was absolutely fascinated by some of the detail that you've shown us in that right-hand image. I haven't seen that floor plan before, but we noticed that down the right-hand side of what used to be Duck Lane and is now Little Britain, there are medical college and nursing accommodation, well before Queen Mary's Nurses' Home, of course. But interesting to note over on the left-hand side, on Giltspur Street, the St. Bartholomew's Tavern. And I'm thinking, did they purposely put that as far away as possible from the medical students on the other side?
We'll come back to the idea of taverns actually later on, because the hospital has a very, very long history and connection with the local hostelries and taverns around the area, going back to the 15th century. So we'll come back to that shortly. And today I'm going to be largely talking about the hospital in the 15th century, because it's the period for which we know the most about the hospital. And it's the period when the hospital is being served by a master. So the hospital has at this time masters rather than governors, a single master who oversees the entire establishment, the entire institution. And in the 15th century, it's a man called John Wakering, alias Blackbird. And this is the list of masters preserved in the hospital's cartulary. And we know a lot about John Wakering because one of his best employees, or most loyal employees, wrote about him extensively. And he was clearly a big fan of the master and talks about the famous works that are memorable to recollect his wondrous wisdom and extraordinary discretion. And if you look at the image on the left of the screen here, this is the list of hospital masters that's been preserved as a form of history. That entire bottom section is to do with John Wakering, and all of his predecessors get just a very small paragraph going above. But as we'll see, I think Wakering genuinely was an amazing master for the hospital. And I think he essentially preserves it and invests in the hospital's fabric, invests in the institution in a way that his predecessors hadn't done. And it's interesting, actually, he is appointed master in 1423. And I hadn't thought about it until the Barts 900 anniversary. He's coming in on the 300th anniversary of the hospital. And this is a time when hospitals around the country are often accused of being mismanaged, and the masters are taking all the possessions for themselves. And actually, he comes in and really turns around what's going on at Barts.
Do we know much about his background and the skills and experience he was able to bring to that role?
We know very little about him. We know he's from Essex, probably from Little Wakering, where the hospital has property. It's very common at this time that if you join a religious house, you will take on the name of where you've come from. So Wakering is probably indicating that that's where he's come from. But it's very difficult this time because there's another John Wakering who is at the heart of royal government, and he's a major bishop. So it can be difficult at times to tease the two apart. But we know a lot about him once he arrives at the hospital. And that's thanks to this man, John Cock, who is a fascinating man. He's a brother of the hospital. He's Wakering's chief administrator, and he writes himself into history regularly. So throughout the cartulary, there are all these notes that things were written by Brother John Cock, and he talks about being in declining age and writing with shaking hands. But there's another brilliant one that I'll come back to shortly. But I think we can see the cartulary is often called Cock's cartulary because we think it was largely written by him or under his supervision or with his insertations. And this is an example of one of those marginal drawings that litter these volumes. And I think what we're actually seeing here is John Cock himself in that small figure praying. So he's literally putting himself into the picture, as it were. So this is why we know so much about the 15th century as opposed to the previous centuries before this. So what I was thinking of talking about tonight is essentially a couple of lessons that we can learn from Wakering's mastership and how he turns the hospital around.
And might there be parallels with how in the present day we can turn hospitals around? Because let's face it, it's not entirely plain sailing, is it?
There will hopefully be some lessons that hospital might want to take forward, others perhaps less so. So one of the first lessons I was going to talk about this evening is the importance of establishing your independence as an institution, because as many of you will know, the hospital was founded in 1123 in combination with the priory that is now St. Barts the Great. They're founded at the same time by a man called Roger, but almost as soon as he dies, the two institutions start a rivalry, essentially. And in the first days, we know that the hospital is very much the junior partner in the relationship. The masters are often called proctors because their main job is going around and getting food and alms for the poor sick. But they are desperate to try and break away. And it takes centuries to do, but we do see step-by-step attempts to try and secure their own management, to secure their own independence, their own property, the right to do their own rentals, to sublet tenants as they wished. And this is a very slow process. We have a series of essentially compromises that take place going on. The main ones are in the 14th century and the early 15th century. But at the time that Wakering takes over, it's still not established. And it's over really petty things a lot of the time. So one of the main problems that keeps coming up is the priory say, you're not allowed to have an image of St. Bartholomew. On Easter Day, you can ring your bells. Well, at first they're not allowed bells, but eventually they say, okay, you can ring your bells, but only once we've rung ours first. And this is all a means of trying to attract local patronage, to attract bequests to the hospital fabric, to the hospital institution. And it's all little bits like this. And it's a gradual process as the hospital eventually is allowed to own its own properties. And they eventually are allowed a bell tower, but it's a step-by-step process. And a lot of it seems to be to do with electing the master, because originally the priory has a veto over the masters, and they actively use that veto. And what that means is while the hospital doesn't have a master, its estates can't be managed effectively. They can't process all of this. So it's disadvantaging the hospital while that's going on. Now, Wakering has very little to do with all of this. At the time he comes in, there is still that it's been largely settled. There are still a few issues. But what he does is he makes sure, or John Cock makes sure, that he is very much linked with the endeavours of his predecessors. So we have in the cartulary a whole list of various agreements that have been arranged between the two institutions, papal bulls and agreements by the bishops of London, and they are all copied out in this cartulary. Now that's pretty normal to copy these things out. They're important, they need to be recorded. But what happens is Cock writes in this that this was done during the time of John Blackbird, or Master Wakering. So it's in effect to very much link himself with what has gone on previously. And he's not beyond using this to his advantage. So even after it's been largely settled, the hospital is in a dispute with a college in the 15th century. And what they do is Wakering turns around and said, oh, I can't possibly answer this because I need the prior's approval before I can do anything. And he actually manages to keep the legal case going for another 20 years using that tactic, even though it's completely not valid at all. So this is one of the things that Wakering tries to do in the 15th century. And what that allows him to do is that allows him to have much greater independence over the hospital's vast property portfolio. So the hospital owns huge amounts of tenements and lands in London and in Essex, largely across London, with some around Tottenham as well. But what he does is they're very careful, Wakering and Cock, to make sure that this is looked after, this property portfolio, and it's diversified and improved as much as possible, which means we get really interesting comments as we go through. So the cartulary is largely concerned with property deeds, and the hospital archives today have a huge amount of medieval property deeds in the collection. But also we have a rental from 1456, and this is an amazing document which literally tells you who's living in the hospital close and where, and also how their properties are being managed. So we've got a few examples here that I can show you. And this is an image of the rental itself. I can't think of another rental that's this detailed for a hospital at the period. It's absolutely amazing survival. But what we find is that they are very interested in brew houses and bakeries. These are the two big things that Wakering and his hospital are interested in. And part of that is because they provide a secondary use to properties. Properties can be a place to live, but by using it as a brew house or a bakehouse, you can also generate extra income from the rental. And brew houses and bakehouses are very interchangeable. So if you have someone coming in, you can quite easily change the use of that cottage, tenement. And we see, for example, there is a brew house called the Hartshorn in Smithfield. And this is, you can see it circled on the plan here. And this is something that, as well as developing these properties and improving them, Wakering is very much interested in trying to extend his properties and bring these new properties into the close around the areas of the edge of the precinct. So I don't think there's a pub here today, but unfortunately,
no, it's where Casualty used to be in the 60s and 70s, and I think it's where the front door of the Nuffield is now.
So yeah, that would have been a brew house called the Hartshorn in the 15th century. We also see further attempts to kind of develop the state of these properties. So one example is this property called a large tenement called the Greyhound on the Hoop. And the hoop here is probably similar to a modern pub sign. And it's a hanging advertisement of what is, so you'd say, I'm going to the Greyhound. They're not all pubs, but it's a way of advertising a property at this time. And what he does is the brewer who's currently in that property dies, and Wakering is directly involved with rebuilding this brew house and changing it into a bakery. And it's really interesting, in the cartulary, it talks about this property being demised to Stephen Paul, baker, then the most famous baker in London. So he's very much the medieval Paul Hollywood. But they're using this as a means of attracting people to come and use their properties. And it's just a fascinating way of how you can redevelop these areas and these tenements. And I can show you where the Greyhound on the Hoop is. So we know it was near to a place called the Elms, which is the medieval gallows, the site of execution in Smithfield. And you can see here, it's on the west side of Smithfield.
It's roughly where Haberdashers' Hall is now, I would say, isn't it?
So I think the most famous bakehouse is probably on the corner of that, the top of that corner of that area of property, which I think is now Ferrari's Cafe, but it's probably not quite as good as Stephen Paul's back in the 15th century. We also get, this is where in these documents, you also see John Wakering and John Cock very much linking themselves with what's going on. They are putting their names next to these properties, next to these redevelopments. So here we can see an entry where Cock is actually, it's the property called the Eagle on the Hoop in Grasschurch Street. This is a note in the document saying that it was redeveloped by Wakering at John Cock's request. So he's saying it's poorly managed, you need to redevelop this, make it better. And this is one of just a few instances that this happens throughout the documents. John Cock is very much a grumpy man when it comes to looking after the hospital's tenants. He gets quite animated when they don't do what he wants. So here we have, for example, the account of someone called James Brampton, who Cock describes as a counterfeit gentleman and never thrifty. And I should say this image on the right of the screen here isn't meant to be Brampton, but the look on that man's face reminds me of John Cock when he's writing this account. He's furious at this man. And we get loads of these throughout the document. James Brampton's is just here on Hosier Lane, so again in that same area to the west of the hospital. And I mean, you think this is a tenement that's being poorly managed, and it's basically on the edge of the hospital precinct. So how they think they were going to get away with it, I've got no idea. If it was in Essex, I can understand, but literally right across from the hospital gate. But Cock is also very happy to praise people who have done well and who have managed their properties effectively. So he talks about here a dwelling in the close next to the Chapel of St Andrew, lately held by Robert Newton and afterwards by James Surrenden, who rebuilt 2 rooms and who did many more good things. So he's very active in praising the good things, but also being quite angry about those who don't manage their properties.
Do we know where the Chapel of St Andrew was in the modern days?
So the Chapel of St Andrew is probably one of those that's in what is now the main hospital square.
Mm-hmm.
It can be quite tricky to pin down these chapels because only the ones that are in that Church of the Holy Cross, they're the only ones that we know exactly where they were. But it would have been either in the central square or slightly further to the south by the graveyard. And here we've got another good example of good tenants. This is a large tenement garden by William Markby Philliser, so he's a clerk in one of the central law courts. Afterwards by Richard Shipley, now granted to Thomas Portalen and Alice, his wife, who built in stone a kitchen, rooms and other pleasing items and who improved it very much. So Cock likes them. This is an interesting entry because this highlights the role that women sometimes have in these records, because Alice is actually married to all 3 of these men in turn and lives in the same property in the hospital. And her story is brilliant. So her brass, monumental brass, is actually still in the church today. I think it's under a carpet a lot of the time.
Well, in Barts the Great or Barts the Less?
The Less.
Right.
So it's well worth going to look at it. It's a lovely brass. But Alice commissions it when she's married to William Markby, the first of these 3 men. She then goes on to live for a couple of decades more before she then passes away. But she's commissioned this brass early on, which means that by the time she passes away and is buried with William and Richard, Thomas becomes a rebel and he doesn't get buried with them at all. By the time she gets married herself, the brass is hugely out of date and unfashionable. Not the brass itself, but the outfit she's wearing in the brass is deemed to be not cool at all by the time that she passes away. But it's already in place, and she's buried there with William Markby and Richard Shipley. She's a fascinating woman. There's an article about her that's been written by a woman called Anne Sutton, and it's a brilliant story of her life, because quite the life living in the same tenement in the hospital. So that's a bit about managing the hospital's portfolio effectively and making sure that people look after their properties. And what they also do is they reward those people who do look after their properties. So there are a number of examples of rents where you just pay a rose per year, despite the property being worth maybe £4 in medieval money. So they are rewarding those who do this good work and who do rebuild things and who do build new buildings and keep them up to date. We don't know if they try and charge people more for being counterfeit gentlemen, but we know that they reward the good works at least. But what the hospital also does is I mentioned a bit about Stephen Paul, the most famous baker in London. Wakering is an absolute genius at advertising his and the hospital's charitable credentials. And he does this, the most notable example is to do with the former mayor of London and wealthy mercer, Richard Whittington. So in that list of masters, we have items recovered by Master John Wakering from the estate of Richard Whittington and John White. So John White is the master of the hospital before Wakering, and he acts as, he's close with Whittington, and he acts as one of his executors, but then he dies shortly around about the same time. So Wakering has this really difficult job in trying to recover gifts that have been given to the hospital from Whittington's estate and from White's estate at the same time. Now, Whittington has given the hospital various gifts, including Wakering gets a cross, a very large cross, some large books, an amazing Bible, but he also bequests 100 shillings to be granted to the poor of the hospital. But he doesn't say how that should be done. And Wakering gets a bit creative in this. So he manages to get a huge sum of money, about £100 of medieval money, which is a huge sum, from various rents as well. And rather than just giving it away as alms, he invests it in the hospital. And what he does is he builds a brand new gate on the east side of the precinct, complete with a window showing charitable works and the arms of Richard Whittington. Now, this has a dual role in that it's advertising Whittington's contribution to the hospital, thus attracting potentially other wealthy benefactors to make a similar bequest to the hospital, because they can see how Whittington's memory has been recorded. But it also shows that people can be spiritually looked after by doing these charitable works. So it's a dual role. I don't know how Whittington would have quite felt about it, because he was a very practical man. One of the main items in his, one of the main bequests he makes to the poor of London is a massive multi-sex toilet in which 100 people can be seated at any one time. So I don't know how he'd feel about his charitable bequest being turned into a gate, but who knows? But it's this is absolutely characteristic of Wakering in that he's taking these bequests and investing them into the hospital fabric and encouraging others to invest in the hospital fabric at the same time.
Presumably, though, if he was literally master of all he surveyed, and he was obviously a man of great entrepreneurial skill, and within that framework, he was allowed to exercise those skills for the benefit of the community.
Yeah, very much so. And we do see this attracting attention. We see wealthy and influential Londoners being attracted to the hospital close and living within the hospital close. And we'll talk a little bit shortly about who some of those people are. But we also see him going around, not quite on people's deathbeds, but going around his community and encourage them to make a donation when the time comes. So entrepreneurial is definitely the right term for Wakering, but it works, and he develops the hospital portfolio and the hospital's fabric so much by doing this, and by encouraging a sense of community within the precinct and within the hospital. He very much wants people to invest and be part of it at the same time. But yeah, absolutely brilliant use of Whittington's bequests. And part of what he does to do this is he wants to make the hospital close a nice place to live, because as well as the poor, you have lots of people living in this area, and their money directly goes to helping the poor. The more people you have that are able to support the hospital, the more good works it can do. So he invests in a school, or at least advertising this school. So we know the hospital had a school for some time before Wakering. We don't know exactly when it first came in, but one of the things that Wakering does is he very much tries to copy what's going on at St. Paul's down the road. So St. Paul's is well known at this time for having an established and well-known school. So Wakering goes and essentially pinches their schoolmaster to come and work at Barts instead. So we have a couple of people who are brought in at different times, but they are very much taken in the element of trying to match St. Paul's. And we know about these school children a little bit. We know about their masters, and they would have been taught basic grammar. They would have been taught how to be involved in the spiritual services in the church. And we have various people's wills who talk about payments being made to children for carrying candles at the time of their funerals. So that's in the top image here. We can see an example of John Barkby, who's the Master of the Scholars of the Hospital of St. Barts, London. So that is one way of trying to make it an educated and intellectually curious community. But the other thing he does is he tries to copy another element that's on at St. Paul's, which is an idea that you have a lane where books are bought and sold and books are copied, and a kind of bookish culture going on. And there's a man called John Shirley, who's in the second of these images here. He's well known in the 15th century as a medieval copyist, a writer, a literary man. And he lives at St. Barts, and he's attracted to live at St. Barts by this kind of culture that's being developed. And we can see in the bottom image here, this is how we know that he actually lives here rather than just renting a property. It's in Middle English, but you can see here, it says, "But hideth him in his house at St. Bartholomew's Spital." So this is evidence that Shirley literally did live here. And we think that Duck Lane, to the east of the hospital, is where they're developing these books to be try and be sold. And certainly later on, we get a bookish culture being developed there. So he's attracting these intellectually curious people to come and be part of this community. And with these schools as well, this is how they support those children from single mothers at Newgate and women who died in childbirth. This is how they're supporting them, giving them that basic education so that they can go on and do something with their lives.
Because that's certainly something that I've understood from hearing previous presentations, that a good many of the, I won't call them patients, because they weren't patients as we understand them today, but a good many of the residents, the long-term population of the hospital were in fact related, be they children or wives, of those who'd been incarcerated at Newgate and who'd fallen on hard times in other respects. Would that be the case?
Yeah, very much so. And this becomes instituted at the time of the hospital's refoundation. But prior to that, there has been this long connection, and we do see efforts to support the prisoners and to make their lives a bit better. But again, because that's this charitable work that's going on in the hospital, and we see that right the way through.
You mentioned the Middle English, and obviously a lot of these documents are in Latin, and all of them are written in a way that is difficult to interpret today. I've got to ask, is this one of your chief skills as a specialist of this time?
Yes, this is very much one of the things that I've had to learn over the last decade, is how to read these documents and translate them. A lot of them are in Latin. The cartularies in Latin, for example. And we've got a quote on the screen here, which is actually from the cartulary in Latin. So yes, it's very much one of the skills that you need to unpick some of this.
And what were you like in Latin at school?
I was terrible at Latin in school. I dropped it as soon as I was able.
And there was I thought you were going to say you did your A-level Latin at the age of 14 and carried on from there.
I didn't do Latin properly until my master's year, when I was given this document and told to work out how to read it. And so this isn't on the screen here now, is another one of those educational intellectual things that Wakering and Koch are trying to develop. This is John Koch's attempt to write a chronicle, or it's a very limited chronicle. It's called an Annals of the Kings of England. And what this does is it tells you who the kings were, when they reigned, the dates, and often where they were buried. And in the early years, Cott doesn't seem to know very much about them, and he does a very limited entry for many of the early kings. We think he probably copies this from a tablet in St. Paul's. So again, it's that idea of copying what St. Paul's are doing, except his Latin is not particularly good, and he makes lots of errors throughout. But I kind of mentioned earlier about he wants to put himself into history. And as you get closer to his modern day, he starts to write himself into these stories as well. So he talks about Henry V's coronation, and he says, and it was Passion Sunday, and it was very rainy. And I know because I was there. So he's writing himself into these stories. But again, it's this idea of trying to develop this intellectually curious community. It's it's probably a failed attempt to chronicle because he doesn't do very much. But again, like with Wakering, he gets more excited the closer he gets to the modern day because that's what he knows about. And you mentioned earlier about Newgate, and what Wakering particularly does in this period, he wants to make this a nice community to live in. And this is a document from the mid-15th century, and we can actually see how the hospital's independence is really coming to the fore now by Wakering's efforts and those of his predecessors. Because the Priory's water supply, which is piped in small pipes from Islington, breaks, and they've got leaking pipes. And the Prior can't afford to fix them. So Wakering says, well, hang on a second, the hospital's got money, we'll step in and do it for you, provided you continue that water into the hospital community so that we can access it as well. We'll pay you a fee, but we want that access to be brought into the hospital community. And they said that there's been no fresh water, so there's been sickness in the hospital. But this is an absolute masterstroke by Wakering in getting this access to clean water at this time. People often say in the medieval period you couldn't drink the water. That's not quite true. If it was freshly piped in, I mean, it was in lead pipes, so you might not want to drink it. But access to fresh water was important. And this is a really good way of making this a nice place to live. And as well, this, again, kind of builds up enthusiasm amongst the hospital community for investing themselves in these efforts and investing in the hospital as a place, as an institution. Because a few years after this, some members of the hospital precinct actually grant the hospital land to extend this water supply even further down to Newgate, so that the prisoners now have access to fresh water as well. And that's not Wakering's doing, but because he's invested in the first step, they're encouraged to put their hands into their own pockets and to invest as well. So,
do we know where this water might have come from? Would it have been Hampstead Heath, or obviously somewhere to the north?
It was Islington. Is all that's all the information that we have, that it's from the Islington area and it's piped down. And we actually have, this is the petition which is asking the king to let them do this, because the king has to agree to these kind of things. But they actually attached a schedule of exactly how it's going to be managed. And each year they say that both sides will contribute to the further restoration, the further improvement of the supply. So it's a brilliant effort to make this a nice place.
For the benefit of our online audience, I should mention that I should have mentioned it right at the top. If you do have any questions, do use the Q&A button which will be at the top or bottom of your screen. I can see a couple of questions have already come in, and we'll deal with them at the end, at the same time as we deal with any questions from within the room, because as well as you out there, we have a good number who've joined us here live in the Henry VIII room in the North Wing. So do keep those questions popping in. Sorry to interrupt you. Carry on.
One of the other things, and this is perhaps Wakering's greatest achievement in the 15th century, is to develop this sense of community amongst those who are living and working within the hospital. So what he does is, at this time, the hospital is outside of the parish system. But what he does is he develops the central church, that Church of the Holy Cross, now St. Bartholomew the Less. He develops that into a quasi-parochial church. So he encourages people to think of it as their parish church. And that's really important because that means that they will make bequests to it, they will pay tithes to it, they will pay burial fees. One of the biggest breakpoints between the hospital and priory earlier was over a graveyard, because if you can bury people, you can increase your income by doing so. And while it's never officially a parish at this time, we see regular accounts of people referring to it in their wills as the parish church of St. Cross. So it's that Holy Cross. And you can see throughout the cartulary, in that illumination I showed at the start, and I'll show at the end of this talk as well, you can see them using the imagery of the Holy Cross and really pushing this, because they can't have an image of St. Bartholomew. So this is the way of getting around it. They rebrand themselves as the Church of the Holy Cross within St. Bartholomew Hospital. And so we can see here two accounts, one of which is a legal case in which, now the legal case is really interesting because legal documents, you have to be very factual and accurate in them. But even in this, we're getting references to the parish of St. Cross within the hospital. So it's clearly deeply ingrained in people's minds that this is, if not an official parish church, this is what they consider to be their parish church. And so we can see here in the top entry, a man whose name I've misspelt here, unfortunately. Apologies for that. A man called Thomas Lloyd, who again is one of these legal officials, and he asked to be buried within the chapel of St. Catherine within the Church of the Holy Cross. His wife doesn't refer to it as a parish church, she just calls it St. Bartholomew. But we can see at least in one instance, he's thinking of it in this way. So that's just a brilliant way of creating this community and this parish element, even when it's not technically part of what's going on.
Did this tension between the priory and the hospital on the use of the phrase St. Bartholomew, did that extend right through to the dissolution?
It becomes less important, mainly because the hospital's in a much stronger situation as the period goes on. And it's more to do with the image. It's having the image of him in the church is the issue here. They're not too fussed about the name. The name can be reused, but it's that image, because people want to be buried before an image of it, which is why they go for the Holy Cross instead. And the Chapel of St. Catherine, I can't quite prove this. I think that is, as you go into the church on the left, I think that area is a space which would have been the Chapel of St. Catherine. But it's quite hard to say from the surviving evidence. Okay, so the final lesson, perhaps, from the 15th century hospital is Wakering's attempts to make friends and influence people, because he's not attracting just anyone to come and live in the hospital and live in the hospital community. He's very keen to attract high status, high influence people to do so. And a lot of these people seem to be lawyers, which is a really interesting move. And we actually have not just lawyers living there. We mentioned those Phyllises, those clerks earlier, who were married to Alice Portalen before those three husbands. We also have legal shops that are being set up in and around that area around Paradise in the northeast of the precinct. And what this means is that people are attracted in to conduct their legal business as well. But it also means if you get in problems, like with the priory, you've got high-level lawyers on hand, on call, to support you and who have a vested interest in the hospital's community. So that's really handy. There's and this is in the 15th century. This goes right the way through to the 17th and possibly a little bit later, at least into the 17th century, that Barts is actually a place where lawyers work and live. And there's an amazing story from the early 17th century where you have two lawyers, one from the Court of Common Pleas and one from the Court of Star Chamber. So these are not rival, but different legal institutions. They both have shops in the hospital, close in the area around the central courtyard where it is today. And they get into a huge dispute over hanging laundry, because they're hanging wet laundry outside their properties, and they claim that people coming to do their legal business are potentially going to get the plague or sweating sickness from this laundry that's hanging. And of course, they're both lawyers, so this goes into a massive dispute in the Court of Star Chamber. And incidentally, the hospital is actually the last place where the records of the Court of Star Chamber are known to have been in the early 17th century. But then they vanish and we have no idea where they've gone to. So if anyone finds an unexplored cellar or anything like that, please do look, just in case there's a raft of medieval and early modern legal records there. But yeah, lawyers are very much attracted. Again, the priory is also linked with this, but the priory get very much told off because their care of these legal records is not particularly good. The prior gets hauled before the courts, the king and his council on one occasion, because the roof of the priory has been leaking all over the records of the Court of King's Bench. So very important to look after these things properly. But there's no evidence that the hospital didn't do that. They seem to be quite good at looking after them in these records. But as well as lawyers, Wakering is very much keen to attract civil servants is the wrong term, men at court, men with influence. So there's a man called Richard Sturgeon, who's a chancery clerk and a very well-known chancery clerk, and he is known to have lived and invested in the hospital. We see in a number of instances Wakering and this legal community very much pursuing bequests that have been made to them. So both Sturgeon and a man called Richard Warner previously have made bequests, and then it gets wrapped up in their executors and it becomes very legalistic and it becomes very troublesome to the hospital. And they use the people they've got on hand to very much fight these cases and to make sure that the hospital gets what's going on here. And it talks about, in the second of these two documents here, it talks about John Wakering, Master of the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in West Smithfield. And it talks about the said Richard Sturgeon for the great love he had into the said hospital, and in special for the great zeal he had for his said chapel. So Sturgeon has made a bequest for a chantry foundation for him and his family in the hospital, and Wakering saying, well, he very much loved this place. He loved the hospital, he loved the foundation that he had made, he loved the chapel he had built, and we should be supporting this and getting this money in. So there's a huge amount of influence that's being brought out. And we also have people like Henry VI's nurse when he'd been a young man, well, a boy, in fact. She then comes to live in the hospital after she's retired, essentially. And so you've got this kind of lawyers on one hand, you've got civil servants on the other hand, but then you've also got a huge community, or an influential community, I should say, of widows who are living here and are being supported in living here. They're being protected, they're being looked after. It's essentially a fancy gated community where people can retire to and live out their lives in peace and quiet, and with lots of gardens around it. It seems to be a lovely place, an aspirational place to want to live at this time. And as well as these widows, I think we've got at least around about 8 people described as widows around about the time of the rental. But we've also got some evidence for the sisters of the hospital. So the hospital's staff as such are brothers and sisters of the hospital. And they're the ones that do the kind of palliative work, the care for the poor, the care for the sick poor. They're the ones who do this day-to-day work. And we have, for example, this woman, Emma Cherbury, who's rebuilding shops as well as part of this. So everyone in the community seems to be investing, buying into this vision of the hospital and what it can be, and working on it. And we very rarely get evidence for sisters in these records. So in the rental, you can very much see what you might not see elsewhere in this presence of women and widows within the community, which is a fascinating insight into their lives.
So these brothers and sisters within the hospital, none of them had taken holy orders in any form, either within the priory, or the sisters were not nuns. They had no qualifications in that regard.
So there are lay sisters and brothers and those who take holy orders, and we see a mix of them at various times throughout the medieval period. Annoyingly, the records don't often tell us which ones are which, so you have to kind of work these things out. So, for example, John Cock is described as Brother John Cock, and we know he's taken holy orders. He started off life as an apprentice goldsmith and gives that up for the church. But in a lot of instances, we don't have that information, so we can't say for sure, sadly. But it's an amazing community, and a lot of these women who are coming here, it's a means of security, because it's a walled community, it's a safe community, and there are women who live here in the medieval period in the 15th century who have been assaulted out in their everyday lives and have come here in later life for a safe place to live, a protected place to live. And so, just to finish up, here's one of the those lovely illuminations, which really shows the Holy Cross, as well as the first time that the arms of Barts are being developed and shown off. And I think that's also very much linked with Wakering as a master in terms of its branding, isn't it? It's making the hospital distinctive. It's making it attractive to invest in and to live in and to potentially work at as well.
You make an interesting point, of course, about the coat of arms, because I certainly thought that coat of arms had its origins around the 12th century, and we now know that it's a pure invention by the entrepreneurs of the 15th century and has no standing with the College of Arms whatsoever. And we have discovered this on the Barts 900th committee. And as you can imagine, we're seeking to make amends, because we will want to use the coat of arms loud and proud over the next 12 months in particular. And so we are now exploring the possibility of finally making it a legal entity and registering it with the College of Arms. I don't know how many of you have visited Venice. You might have seen the Doge's Palace. There is what you might think is the Barts coat of arms up there on the wall of the Doge's Palace, and that predates its use here. Fascinating times, all one and all.
Yeah. So, kind of a few final words from me on this is I originally pitched this How to Run a Medieval Hospital as a slightly tongue-in-cheek way of looking back at the past. And I mean, obviously, the hospital wouldn't invest in a bunch of pubs around Smithfield today, but I think we can see from Wakering's entrepreneurial spirit and the way he tries to instill this community spirit amongst the hospital and its precinct is very much a lesson that we can take forward and to encourage people to invest in, to buy into that history going forward.
Euan, thank you so much. Let's move on to a few questions. So while the audience here at Barts gather their thoughts, let's just pull down a few from our online audience, if you just give us a moment. We've got a couple of questions here regarding the article by Anne Sutton. Is it possible to share a link to that article at some stage?
I'm sure I can provide a link after this.
Okay, we can dig that out. Now, yes, somebody makes an interesting point. You spoke about the way in which a year's supply of water was 6 and 8pence, which of course is 1/3 of a pound.
Mm-hmm.
How far did that go in the 1400s? And is it possible to talk about that in a modern day equivalent?
I knew I should have done this before when I put this into the PowerPoint, because we have got on the National Archives website a currency converter. But off the top of my head, I can't say exactly how much that would be in a modern sense, but it's 6 and 8pence is probably it's not a huge sum of money. It's I wouldn't like to say an exact figure because I'll no doubt get it wrong.
I think I would simply comment there are a number of online calculators, are there not, that will allow you, and of course it's not a straightforward thing, because you're talking on some cases about purchasing power, about economic value, and there are so many other parameters, are there not? So but if you simply put into your web browser historic currency calculator, then should hopefully point you in the right answer.
Our National Archives Fund will tell you how many cows and horses you could buy with that sum of money at various points throughout history. So I can recommend it.
Thank you.
We must draw matters to a conclusion once again. Thank you so much, Euan, for an absolutely fascinating project. Before we close, I know one or two of you online have asked, is this part of a series of lectures? Well, yes, indeed it is, because as those regular guests will have known, we've been running these webinars on a variety of specialist topics for the last couple of years through the pandemic, and we intend to continue them. In fact, Will and I have a meeting next week where we're going to be mapping out our schedule for meetings, walkabouts, discussions, for the next 6 months leading up to the all-important View Day in May, and then, of course, the building project beyond that. So thank you so much to our guest here in the Henry VIII room. Thank you so much to you out there for joining us. Until next time, bye-bye from us both. Bye-bye.